James Riddle Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana, a small town resting in the shadows of America's rapidly industrializing Midwest. His father, a coal miner of Pennsylvania Dutch descent, passed away when Jimmy was just 7 years old, leaving his mother to shoulder the burden of raising the family in an era when widowed women had little support. The hardship of his early years imprinted itself deeply on him. Poverty was not an abstract social issue, but a daily companion. From this crucible of deprivation emerged a boy who quickly learned to equate survival with solidarity. Hoffa's formative experiences in the hard-scrabble towns of Indiana and later Detroit cultivated a spirit of determination and resilience that would one day propel him to the highest ranks of organized labor in America. By the time Hoffa reached his teens, the industrial Midwest was swelling with new waves of workers, immigrants, migrants, and native-born Americans alike, who sought jobs in factories, warehouses, and rail yards. Detroit, where Hoffa's family relocated in the 1920s, stood as a beacon of opportunity thanks to the booming automobile industry. Yet beneath the promise of jobs lay harsh realities: brutal hours, meager pay, and dangerous working conditions. Hoffa, like many youths from working-class families, had to forego higher education to contribute to household income. At just 14, he left school and began working in manual labor jobs, eventually landing a position loading crates in a grocery warehouse. This warehouse would prove to be his first battleground, a place where Hoffa cut his teeth in labor organizing and began the journey that would make him one of the most controversial and powerful union leaders in American history. Hoffa's initiation into labor activism came not through abstract ideology, but through lived necessity. Workers in the grocery warehouse faced grueling conditions, heavy lifting with little safety consideration, long hours without overtime, and pay so low it barely sustained their families. The turning point came when Hoffa, still barely out of boyhood, decided to challenge the status quo. Organizing fellow workers around a demand for better treatment, he discovered a natural charisma and an ability to connect with men twice his age. He had an intuitive grasp of negotiation, understanding when to cajole, when to threaten, and when to compromise. Hoffa's first success, convincing the warehouse management to concede to basic demands, may have seemed small in scale, but for him, it was proof of a greater principle, that collective action could shift the balance of power between worker and employer. This early victory ignited Hoffa's lifelong devotion to labor organizing. The grocery warehouse incident marked not just the beginning of his personal career, but also his symbolic alignment with a larger American struggle. The quest for dignity among workers in an economy tilted heavily toward industrialists and corporate power. Hoffa's reputation for courage, resourcefulness, and relentless advocacy grew quickly. Word spread among Detroit's working class of a young man unafraid to challenge authority, a fighter who stood shoulder to shoulder with his peers rather than above them. It was not long before Hoffa came into contact with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a union representing truck drivers and warehouse workers. The Teamsters, still modest in size during the early 1930s, were poised to expand alongside the trucking industry, a sector that would become the lifeblood of American commerce. Hoffa formally joined the Teamsters in 1932, just as the Great Depression was reaching its cruelest depths. It was a time when unemployment ravaged entire communities, wages plummeted, and families struggled to put food on the table. Yet paradoxically, the crisis also created fertile ground for labor unions. Workers, battered by desperation, were increasingly willing to stand together in pursuit of fairer conditions. Hoffa's entry into the Teamsters coincided with this surge of labor unrest, positioning him to ride the wave of collective momentum. From the outset, Hoffa distinguished himself not merely as a participant, but as a rising star, a man with the willpower, tactical brilliance, an iron stomach required to wrestle concessions from employers who had long treated unions as nuisances to be crushed. By the mid-1930s, Hoffa was already carving out a reputation as one of the most dynamic young leaders in Detroit's labor scene. He was small in stature, barely 5.5 feet tall, but what he lacked in height he more than made up for with grit and presence. His booming voice, piercing eyes, and unyielding confidence gave him an aura of command. More importantly, he embodied the ethos of the working man, plain-spoken, approachable, and utterly committed to the cause. Unlike some union leaders who leaned heavily on rhetoric, Hoffa led with action. He organized strikes, negotiated contracts, and built networks of loyalty that extended beyond the warehouse floor into the neighborhoods and taverns where working-class life unfolded. Hoffa's rise during this period mirrored the transformation of the Teamsters themselves, as the union evolved from a local force into a national powerhouse. When Jimmy Hoffa formally joined the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in the early 1930s, the union was still far from the juggernaut it would later become. The Teamsters had been founded in 1903 as a loose federation of drivers who hauled goods with horse-drawn wagons. But by the time Hoffa entered, the industry had begun a dramatic shift. Trucks were replacing horses, and the nation's economy increasingly relied on over-the-road freight transportation. The Teamsters, poised at the heart of this evolution, had the potential to wield enormous leverage in American commerce. Hoffa saw that potential more clearly than most, and he would devote his life to harnessing it. Detroit became the stage on which Hoffa first demonstrated his ability to grow the union's strength. The city, with its sprawling auto factories and massive networks of suppliers, was already one of the busiest industrial hubs in the nation. Truck drivers and warehouse workers were the arteries of this system, and their labor stoppages had the power to cripple production. Hoffa quickly recognized that the Teamsters' influence would depend not only on the number of workers they could enroll, but also on the solidarity they could enforce. His style was hands-on, personal, and relentless. He would spend hours on the road, visiting trucking yards, talking with drivers, and persuading them to join the cause. He was a natural recruiter, blending empathy with determination, often reminding workers that without their unity, they would remain at the mercy of employers who could replace or underpay them at will. As Hoffa gained responsibility within Local 299 of the Teamsters, he began developing a reputation as a brilliant strategist. He understood that strikes were a double-edged sword. They could win concessions, but they could also bankrupt unions and alienate the public. To minimize risk, Hoffa perfected what became known as the quickie strike. Instead of announcing long work stoppages, he organized sudden, targeted walkouts that disrupted operations just enough to pressure employers without allowing them to mount large-scale resistance. These tactics proved highly effective, earning Hoffa respect among union members and wariness among employers. In Detroit, the Teamsters began winning better wages, safer conditions, and stronger job security, victories that reverberated across the labor movement. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Hoffa had become one of the most prominent figures in the Detroit labor scene. His rise was aided by the unique historical moment. The New Deal had strengthened labor rights through legislation like the Wagner Act, which guaranteed workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. Yet the Teamsters still faced fierce opposition from companies and rival unions. Hoffa proved adept at navigating these conflicts, sometimes by sheer force of will, other times by cutting shrewd deals. He was unafraid of confrontation, whether with corporate executives, strikebreakers, or even fellow labor leaders who challenged his authority. Hoffa's growing profile caught the attention of the Teamsters' national leadership, particularly Daniel J. Tobin, the longtime president of the union. Tobin was wary of Hoffa's brash style, but could not ignore his results. Hoffa was instrumental in consolidating Teamster power in Michigan and beyond, building local strength that would eventually serve as the foundation for nationwide expansion. Through a combination of charisma, tactical brilliance, and an ability to inspire loyalty, Hoffa transformed Local 299 into one of the most influential chapters in the Union. World War II further amplified the Teamsters' importance. As the nation mobilized for war, transportation became critical. Truck drivers were essential for moving materials across the country, and Hoffa ensured that the Teamsters leveraged this necessity to secure favorable contracts. While many unions pledged no-strike agreements during the war effort, Hoffa and his allies found ways to pressure employers without provoking federal crackdowns. It was during this period that Hoffa solidified his reputation as a man who could deliver tangible gains for his members, often faster and more effectively than rival unions. By the post-war years, Hoffa's influence had expanded far beyond Detroit. He played a key role in the Central States Conference of Teamsters, an organization that coordinated activities across a multi-state region. It was here that Hoffa refined one of his most significant strategies: regional and national organizing. Instead of negotiating contracts city by city, Hoffa pushed for agreements that covered entire regions. This not only streamlined bargaining, but also gave the union immense power. A strike in one area could ripple across multiple states, placing extraordinary pressure on employers. This approach culminated in Hoffa's dream of a nationwide master freight agreement, a contract that would standardize wages and conditions for truck drivers across the United States. The concept was revolutionary and ambitious, reflecting both Hoffa's vision and his audacity. For workers, it promised consistency and fairness regardless of where they lived. For employers, it was a nightmare, stripping them of the ability to play local unions against one another. The groundwork Hoffa laid in the 1940s and 1950s would eventually make the Master Freight Agreement a reality, cementing the Teamsters as the most powerful union in America. By the time Hoffa became vice president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1952, his reputation was larger than life. He was both admired and feared, celebrated as a hero by rank-and-file workers, and demonized as a ruthless strongman by critics. His style was direct, pragmatic, and uncompromising. He once famously said, "If you've got it, a truck brought it," encapsulating both the pride and the leverage of the Teamsters. Under his leadership, the union was no longer simply a defender of truck drivers. It was a force that touched nearly every aspect of American life. Groceries, steel, automobiles, clothing, all moved by truck, and therefore all within the Teamsters' reach. By the early 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa was no longer just a promising local leader within the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. He was a national force. His rise to the position of vice president of the union in 1952 marked the beginning of a period in which Hoffa would transform the Teamsters into the largest and most powerful labor organization in the United States. At its peak under his leadership, the Teamsters boasted more than 2 million members, stretching across nearly every sector of transportation and logistics. Hoffa, a man of working-class roots and unrelenting determination, had become the embodiment of labor muscle in post-war America. Hoffa's leadership style was as direct as it was effective. Unlike other union leaders who were known for lofty rhetoric or intellectual arguments, Hoffa communicated in the language of the shop floor. He was accessible, plain-spoken, and often brutally honest. Workers trusted him because he seemed like one of their own, someone who had loaded crates and driven trucks, who knew firsthand the struggles of long hours, dangerous conditions, and insufficient pay. At rallies and meetings, Hoffa inspired loyalty not through abstract visions of class struggle, but through concrete promises: higher wages, better benefits, job security, and dignity. He delivered on those promises with relentless consistency, and in doing so, he cultivated an almost cult-like devotion among rank-and-file Teamsters. Yet Hoffa's power extended far beyond his union membership. The Teamsters' control over trucking and distribution gave them enormous influence over the entire American economy. If Hoffa called for a strike, it could paralyze entire industries, from steel to automobiles to retail. Few politicians or corporate executives could afford to ignore him, and many sought his favor. This made Hoffa not only a labor leader, but also a political kingmaker. Candidates for office, particularly at the state and federal levels, courted him for endorsements, campaign funds, and organizational support. Hoffa, in turn, used these relationships to further solidify the Teamsters' power and to shield the union from government interference. But with power came controversy. Hoffa's growing influence coincided with the rise of the federal government's scrutiny of labor unions, particularly in the wake of widespread public concern about corruption and organized crime. The trucking industry had long been a target for infiltration by the mob, which saw opportunities in extortion, loan sharking, and control of union pension funds. Hoffa's pragmatic approach to leadership meant that he often blurred the lines between ally and adversary. He was willing to make deals with unsavory figures if it meant advancing the interests of his members. Critics accused him of inviting organized crime into the very heart of the Teamsters. Hoffa countered that his only loyalty was to his workers, and that he would use any means necessary to protect their livelihoods. The 1950s also brought Hoffa into the public spotlight in unprecedented ways. Congressional hearings, most notably those led by Senator Estes Kefauver and later the McClellan Committee, sought to expose corruption within the labor movement. Televised hearings introduced Americans to the image of Hoffa as a combative, unapologetic, and fiercely intelligent witness. While other union leaders wilted under questioning, Hoffa relished the opportunity to spar with senators and prosecutors. He displayed a sharp wit, a near photographic memory, and an uncanny ability to deflect accusations. To his supporters, he appeared as a fearless defender of working people against hostile elites. To his detractors, he seemed the very embodiment of corruption and arrogance within organized labor. The tension between Hoffa and political authorities escalated dramatically in the late 1950s and early 1960s with the rise of John F. Kennedy and his younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Robert, in particular, made it his mission as chief counsel of the Senate's Select Committee on Improper Activities in the labor or management field to bring Hoffa down. Their clashes became legendary. Robert Kennedy painted Hoffa as a dangerous, lawless figure who had corrupted one of the nation's largest unions for personal gain and mob enrichment. Hoffa, never one to shy away from a fight, mocked Kennedy as a privileged elitist who could not possibly understand the realities of working men and women. Their feud became a central drama of American public life, culminating in Robert Kennedy's appointment as Attorney General in 1961, where he intensified efforts to prosecute Hoffa. Despite mounting legal troubles, Hoffa continued to expand the reach of the Teamsters. His crowning achievement came in 1964 with the negotiation of the National Master Freight Agreement, a landmark deal that standardized wages, hours, and working conditions for truckers across the country. It was the largest collective bargaining agreement in American history at the time, and a testament to Hoffa's vision of nationwide union power. For millions of workers, it meant unprecedented job security and prosperity. For Hoffa, It cemented his reputation as the most successful labor negotiator of his era. Even his fiercest critics had to acknowledge that he delivered real, tangible results for his members. Yet Hoffa's very success also deepened suspicions and resentment. Business leaders accused him of holding the economy hostage. Politicians feared the political power of a union leader who could swing elections. Journalists probed his ties to organized crime, portraying him as a shadowy figure who blurred the line between legitimate labor advocacy and underworld dealings. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover eventually turned its attention to Hoffa, collecting evidence that would later form the basis for his prosecutions. By the mid-1960s, Hoffa stood at a paradoxical crossroads. He had achieved heights of power unimaginable for a man who had started life as a poor boy in Indiana. He commanded the loyalty of millions, controlled a union that could sway the national economy, and had carved his place in American history. Yet the walls were closing in. The Kennedy Justice Department was relentless, and the public appetite for rooting out corruption in labor unions was growing stronger. Hoffa's defiance, once a source of admiration, was increasingly seen as arrogance. His legacy, which could have been defined by his victories for working people, was now shadowed by allegations of corruption and criminality. By the early 1960s, Jimmy Hoffa was one of the most recognizable figures in America. His name was synonymous with labor power, and his face was regularly splashed across newspapers and television screens. But Hoffa's growing visibility was a double-edged sword. While it magnified his stature as a champion of the working man, it also made him the prime target of government investigations. Chief among his adversaries was Robert F. Kennedy, first as chief counsel for the Senate's McClellan Committee, and later as Attorney General under President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's determination to get Hoffa was no secret, and their clashes became a defining drama of the era. The McClellan hearings in the late 1950s set the stage. Broadcast nationally, they introduced millions of Americans to the sight of Hoffa sparring with senators and lawyers. Hoffa's sharp wit, photographic memory, and fearless defiance made for riveting television. He seemed to enjoy the confrontations, parrying questions with precision, sometimes ridiculing his interrogators, and never once appearing intimidated. For many working-class Americans, Hoffa's defiance of authority only strengthened their admiration for him. Yet to Robert Kennedy, Hoffa was a menace, an emblem of corruption, gangsterism, and the betrayal of labor's ideals. Kennedy's frustration with Hoffa was so intense that he titled his 1960 book, The Enemy Within, casting the Union leader as the chief villain in a larger narrative of labor corruption. When Kennedy became Attorney General in 1961, his personal mission became institutional policy. He directed federal resources toward the relentless pursuit of Hoffa, authorizing wiretaps, surveillance, and investigations into the Teamsters' financial dealings. The government sought to prove that Hoffa had misused union pension funds, accepted bribes, and maintained illicit ties with organized crime. Hoffa responded with characteristic bravado, accusing Kennedy of waging a vendetta and portraying himself as a victim of political persecution. His supporters rallied behind him, convinced that the government was less interested in protecting workers than in weakening their most effective advocate. Despite Hoffa's skill at evading prosecution, the government's persistence eventually bore fruit. In 1964, Hoffa was convicted in two major cases. The first was for jury tampering in a trial related to charges of bribery and corruption. Evidence showed that Hoffa and his associates had attempted to influence jurors, a crime that struck at the very heart of the legal process. The second conviction, handed down later that year, was for fraud and conspiracy in connection with the handling of the Teamsters Pension Fund. Hoffa and his allies had allegedly used the fund as a personal slush pool, channeling money into questionable loans and investments tied to organized crime figures. The combined sentences from these convictions amounted to 13 years in prison. For Hoffa, a man who had built his career on relentless motion, constant negotiation, and the thrill of combat, the prospect of confinement was devastating. Yet even in defeat, he refused to show weakness. At press conferences, he vowed to appeal, to fight on, and to one day return to the leadership of the Teamsters. His defiance remained intact, though his power was now deeply shaken. In 1967, Hoffa reported to the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Prison life was a stark contrast to the bustling, high-stakes world he had inhabited. Stripped of his freedom, Hoffa struggled to adjust to the monotony and indignities of incarceration. Yet even behind bars, he refused to fade into obscurity. He kept in close contact with Union allies, sought updates on Teamster affairs, and plotted his eventual return. He also maintained a steady stream of visitors, both loyalists and curious politicians, who recognized that his influence extended beyond prison walls. During Hoffa's imprisonment, leadership of the Teamsters shifted to Frank Fitzsimmons, a longtime ally whom Hoffa had helped elevate. At first, Fitzsimmons seemed a placeholder, expected to keep the seat warm until Hoffa could reclaim it. But as time passed, Fitzsimmons began consolidating his own authority. Unlike Hoffa, he cultivated a less confrontational relationship with politicians and employers. To Hoffa, this was betrayal. From his prison cell, he sent letters and messages attempting to direct union affairs, but Fitzsimmons increasingly ignored them. The once unbreakable bond between Hoffa and the Teamsters began to unravel, replaced by bitter rivalry. Hoffa's imprisonment coincided with dramatic shifts in American society. The labor movement itself was under strain, facing challenges from automation, globalization, and a changing political climate. The Teamsters, though still powerful, were under heightened scrutiny from federal authorities who continued to investigate corruption and organized crime ties. Hoffa watched these developments with frustration, convinced that only his leadership could restore the Union's strength and independence. In 1971, after 4 years in prison, Hoffa's fortunes took an unexpected turn. President Richard Nixon, whose administration was courting labor support, commuted Hoffa's sentence. The decision was controversial, sparking accusations that it had been influenced by political calculations and shady backroom deals. Nevertheless, Hoffa walked out of prison a free man. For him, the release was both vindication and opportunity. He immediately declared his intention to regain the presidency of the Teamsters and to reclaim his role as the Union's guiding force. Yet Hoffa's return to freedom came with strings attached. As part of the commutation, he was barred from engaging in Union activity until 1980. Hoffa, however, had no intention of abiding by these restrictions. Almost immediately, he began maneuvering to challenge Fitzsimmons and to reassert control. He reached out to old allies, attempted to rally rank-and-file support, and sought ways to circumvent the legal limitations placed upon him. His efforts, however, met resistance not only from Fitzsimmons, but also from powerful figures in organized crime, many of whom had grown accustomed to dealing with the more pliable Fitzsimmons. Hoffa's determination to return threatened their interests, making him a dangerous liability. By the mid-1970s, Hoffa was engaged in a high-stakes struggle to reclaim his legacy. Out of prison but under constant surveillance, blocked by rivals within his own union, and entangled with mobsters who no longer considered him useful, Hoffa stood at a precarious crossroads. His old weapons, charisma, loyalty, and sheer willpower, were still formidable, but the world he had once dominated had changed. The battle for control of the Teamsters would soon become inseparable from the mystery that would define the final chapter of his life. On the morning of July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa left his home in Bloomfield Township, a suburb of Detroit, for what he believed would be an important meeting. He told his family he was heading to the Machus Red Fox, a restaurant in Bloomfield Hills, to meet with two men tied to both the Teamsters and organized crime, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a reputed Detroit mobster, and Anthony Tony Provenzano, a Teamster leader from New Jersey with a long history in the underworld. Hoffa was reportedly eager to resolve disputes surrounding his attempted return to power within the Teamsters. He was also said to be growing frustrated with the stalling tactics of Fitzsimmons and the mob figures who supported him. Hoffa never returned home. When Hoffa failed to appear that evening, his family grew concerned. By the next morning, his disappearance had become front-page news across the nation. The FBI quickly launched an investigation, treating the case as a likely kidnapping and murder. Hoffa's car was found in the restaurant parking lot, but there were no signs of struggle. Witnesses reported seeing him pacing outside the Machus Red Fox, apparently waiting for his associates, but accounts diverged after that. Some claimed he entered a car with unidentified men. Others said he was lured away under false pretenses. What was certain was that Hoffa vanished without leaving a trace. A shocking end for one of the most famous men in America. Speculation about Hoffa's fate began immediately and has never truly ceased. The most widely accepted theory is that Hoffa was murdered on orders from organized crime leaders who saw him as a threat. His determination to retake control of the Teamsters jeopardized their access to the union's vast pension fund, which had been a lucrative source of loans and influence. The mob, according to this theory, arranged the meeting as a trap. Once Hoffa arrived, he was taken away and killed, his body disposed of in a manner designed to ensure it would never be found. Over the years, countless rumors and supposed leads surfaced. Some claimed Hoffa's body had been buried beneath the end zone of Giant Stadium in New Jersey, a theory that captured the public imagination but was never substantiated. Others suggested he had been cremated in a mob-controlled funeral home, dissolved in a vat of acid, or buried at a construction site in Detroit. The FBI conducted numerous digs, raids, and forensic examinations, but every promising lead ended in disappointment. The mystery only deepened as each fruitless search reinforced the idea that Hoffa's killers had orchestrated a near-perfect disappearance. The investigation into Hoffa's disappearance became one of the most extensive in FBI history. Agents interviewed hundreds of witnesses, combed through union records, and pursued connections across multiple states. Yet despite their efforts, no one was ever charged in connection with the case. The silence was telling. Those who knew the truth were either too frightened or too loyal to break the code of Omerta, the underworld's code of silence. Over time, the cast of potential suspects, mobsters, Teamster officials, and intermediaries, began to dwindle as figures died, were imprisoned, or simply faded into obscurity. For Hoffa's family, the disappearance was a source of enduring anguish. His wife, Josephine, and his children lived in limbo, deprived of closure. They knew Hoffa was almost certainly dead, but the absence of a body or definitive proof meant that hope lingered, however faintly. In 1982, after years without progress, Hoffa was declared legally dead, though the declaration did little to resolve the emotional turmoil surrounding his case. Hoffa's disappearance also had profound symbolic significance. It marked the end of an era in which labor leaders could wield enormous, unchecked power. His fate became a cautionary tale about the dangers of entangling legitimate union business with organized crime. For the American public, the story of a man who had once stood at the pinnacle of labor influence, only to vanish without explanation, held an irresistible fascination. Books, documentaries, and films revisited the case repeatedly, each offering new theories but few concrete answers. Martin Scorsese's 2019 film The Irishman, based on the memoir of hitman Frank Sheeran, revived interest by dramatizing one version of events, that Hoffa was killed by Sheeran at the behest of mob bosses. Yet even that account remains disputed. The enigma of Hoffa's disappearance has allowed him to endure in the public imagination in a way that few labor leaders ever have. Had he lived out his life in quiet retirement, his legacy might have been confined to Union history. Instead, his mysterious end transformed him into a figure of folklore, the subject of endless speculation and conspiracy theories. Hoffa's name became shorthand for the unsolved and the unknowable, invoked whenever someone disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Half a century after that July day in 1975, Hoffa's fate remains unsolved, and the Machu's Red Fox, long since closed, has become a symbol of unanswered questions. The FBI officially closed its most recent investigation in 2022 after yet another unsuccessful dig, acknowledging that the case may never be solved. Yet the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa lives on, ensuring that his story will continue to fascinate generations to come. The story of Jimmy Hoffa did not end with his disappearance in 1975. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a second life, one lived in memory, myth, and cultural imagination. Hoffa's legacy is complex, combining the achievements of a union leader who delivered real gains to working people, with the darker shadows of corruption, criminal ties, and an unresolved death. To understand his enduring impact, one must weigh both the man he was and the symbol he became. For millions of American workers, Hoffa's name remains synonymous with strength, resilience, and solidarity. His crowning achievement, the National Master Freight Agreement of 1964, provided higher wages, standardized working conditions, and security for truckers across the nation. That contract, the largest collective bargaining agreement in American history at the time, stood as proof of Hoffa's extraordinary negotiating skill. He gave voice to men and women who had long been dismissed as replaceable cogs in the machinery of commerce. Under his leadership, the Teamsters became not only the largest union in the United States, but also one of the most powerful voices in American life. For his members, Hoffa was more than a leader. He was a champion who delivered on his promises. Yet Hoffa's legacy is inseparable from the allegations and realities of corruption. His willingness to work with organized crime figures, whether out of necessity, pragmatism, or personal ambition, left a permanent stain on the labor movement. The Teamsters under Hoffa were often portrayed as a union where loyalty trumped legality, where pension funds could be used to bankroll mob operations, and where intimidation sometimes replaced negotiation. For critics, Hoffa embodied the dangers of concentrated labor power unmoored from ethical restraint. His career fueled public skepticism toward unions at a time when organized labor was otherwise at its strongest. In this sense, Hoffa's choices not only elevated his union, but also contributed to a growing backlash against the labor movement in the decades that followed. Culturally, Hoffa became a figure larger than life. His disappearance, unsolved and endlessly debated, elevated him from labor leader to folk legend. Theories about his fate became part of American humor and mythology. References to "where Hoffa's buried" entered everyday conversation. Writers, filmmakers, and musicians found in him a symbol of mystery, power, and decline. Jack Nicholson portrayed him in the 1992 film Hoffa, while Al Pacino's turn as the union leader in Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, 2019, introduced Hoffa's story to new generations. Each retelling shaped him anew, sometimes as a tragic hero, sometimes as a corrupt boss, and sometimes as both at once. Within the labor movement, Hoffa's influence remains contested. To many Teamsters, he is remembered with respect, even reverence. His son, James P. Hoffa, carried on the family name, serving as president of the Teamsters from 1999 to 2022. The younger Hoffa's leadership ensured that the Hoffa legacy remained intertwined with the union's identity, even as it moved toward reform and greater transparency. To others, however, Jimmy Hoffa stands as a cautionary tale, a reminder that unchecked power, even when wielded for noble ends, can lead to ruin. His story illustrates both the potential and the peril of labor leadership in a nation where unions have long walked the line between advocacy and exploitation. On a broader level, Hoffa's life offers lessons about the complexities of American democracy. He rose from poverty to a position of extraordinary influence, proving the power of collective action to transform lives. Yet his fall demonstrates the consequences of entangling legitimate movements with corruption. Hoffa's career was, in many ways, a microcosm of the labor movement itself, capable of achieving monumental victories for workers, yet vulnerable to compromise and scandal. In the end, Jimmy Hoffa remains a figure who resists simple categorization. Was he a hero of the working class or a corrupt opportunist, a victim of political persecution, or an architect of his own downfall? The answer lies somewhere in between, in the gray areas where power, loyalty, and morality intersect. His disappearance left these questions forever unresolved, allowing each generation to reinterpret him through the lens of its own concerns. Today, Hoffa's legacy endures not only in the contracts and protections he won for workers, but also in the enduring mystery that surrounds his fate. His story continues to captivate historians, journalists, and ordinary people alike, because it embodies both the promise and the peril of American labor, the tension between power and principle, and the fascination of a life that ended without answers. Jimmy Hoffa may be gone, but the legend of Jimmy Hoffa, labor leader, outlaw, martyr, mystery, lives on.